So I thought about that for a long time. I wanted to know what the roots were of the Marxist system and what the roots were of the Western system, and what I surmised was that the Western system was actually something that evolved, whereas the communist system was a rationalist construction that was imposed, and they weren't the same thing. And so then I wondered, well, what's Western culture grounded in, and is there any reason to assume that that's real in any sense? And so that's what took me into the study of the underlying stories, the fundamental stories upon which our culture, I believe, is based. And some of those are very old. I'm going to tell you a Mesopotamian story. It's one of the oldest stories we know. I'm going to tell you an Egyptian story. Those are sources of our culture. And I think those stories are grounded in much older traditions. And I think they refer to something real, actually real. Now, I already told you that there are different ways of conceptualizing real, and that my initial hypothesis, presumption, axiom, you might say, is that pain is the most real, and the reason I believe that is because that's how people act. Now, you can criticize that. You can certainly come up with an alternate conceptual framework, which the scientists have, because they believe that the most real thing is matter. Maybe we need more than one set of tools to operate in the world. It's possible. So now I want to tell you what I think the fundamental constituent elements are of stories. And one of the things that I hope is that knowing this will make you immunize you against ideology. And the reason, because I believe that ideologies are fragmentary meta-narratives, and they have their power because they're grounded in the meta-narrative, but they only tell part of the story. But they have power because they're grounded in the fundamental narrative. And so here's the fundamental narrative as far as the characters, let's say. And we're going to say that people are prone to characterize the world. We're social primates, we're social cognitive primates, so we tend to see the world through the lens of a social creature. And so, and partly because we're concerned with acting in the world, and the world is mostly other people, then we conceptualize the ground of that structure for action in characterological terms. So the most fundamental reality is chaos. And chaos is what you don't understand at all. You can't even conceptualize it. You come into contact with it in bits and pieces. When the towers fell, when the Twin Towers fell, chaos reigned for a few days. Everyone was shell-shocked. And that was chaos. And chaos is what you experience when your story falls apart. And that's a descent to the underworld. That's chaos. And basically you live in order and chaos. And order is where, when you do what you think you should do, what you want to have happen, happens. That's order. That's explored territory. And chaos is when you do what you're supposed to do to get what you want, and it doesn't happen. And then that place that you're magically in when that happens, that's chaos. And it has different depths. You could say it reaches all the way to hell, and that usually happens when your life falls apart very badly, and you're down in that chaos, and you realize that it was your fault, and that you did something wrong, and that you knew it and you ignored it. That's the worst form of chaos. So there's chaos itself, and then the next thing is fairly straightforward. You could think there's the individual exists in culture, and culture is embedded in nature. Pretty straightforward. Nature is mother nature for reasons we'll get into, and culture is father culture. And I think that's because the fundamental dominance hierarchies in human primates are masculine, and that nature is assimilated to the feminine because it's, well, for two reasons. First of all, females do the sexual selection among human beings, so they actually are nature from the Darwinian perspective. And second, nature is the productive biological force. And so we've always conceptualized males and females, and we've used that conceptualization to sort out the world at large. It's a metaphor. But it's not just a metaphor, you know, it's reasonable to consider culture as a judgmental father. It's really reasonable because, you know, you have a group of people around you, some friends, some people that watch you work, some judges, and that stretches across a very long expanse of time, and those people as an aggregate make an entity that is judging your reputation constantly. And it's perfectly reasonable to personify that because it's like a meta person that's watching you. And so it's a useful metaphor. There's a meta person that's watching you. Well, yeah, there is, obviously. So now you could say, well, that's not real. It's like, it's not real the way a scientific truth is real. It's a different kind of real. Well, nature has two elements. It's destructive and creative. Obviously, there's the beauty of nature and its bountiful element, and then there's, you know, Anopheles mosquitoes and elephantiasis and cancer and starvation and all the terrible elements of nature. And then there's culture, and culture is tyrannical because you have to shape yourself, involuntarily even, to get along with other people. You sacrifice a lot of yourself and develop yourself, but you sacrifice a lot of yourself in that endeavor, right? We have to kind of average ourselves out in order to live together, and some societies are more tyrannical than others, but there's always a tyrannical element. You see that at university, you know, you guys know that to some degree, this is such a big place, it's easy to feel like a number here, and that whether or not you're here or not doesn't matter. The institution doesn't care. Well, that's the tyrannical element of it. Now, it does care because here you are and you're getting educated and all that, and so maybe that's positive. But it's got both. These characters always have two sides. You know, there's the negative side and the positive side of nature. And there's the negative side and the positive side of culture. And then there's the individual. So the individual is like standing on an island in the midst of an ocean. That's a good imagistic conceptualization of your position. There's solid ground, it has a limited expanse, and outside of that is everything you don't understand. And you as an individual have a positive and negative element as well, and that's the hero and the villain. And of course, what good is a story without a hero and a villain? And the villain is the person who isn't acting like a person should act, and the hero is the person who's acting like a person should act. And so you go to movies and you read books, and there's heroes and there's villains, and to some degree what you're doing is you're fleshing out your notion of a villain. You know, you read about 30 villains and you think, well, there's something villainous about the villains, that's the central element of villainy, whatever that is, and you could imagine you construct out a meta-villain and a meta-hero, and those are the characters in religious stories, generally speaking. You know, in the Marvel movies, there's Odin, and Odin has two sons, right? Thor and Loki. Thor is like the world-redeeming hero, and Loki is the trickster who wants to bring everything down. And you have to recognize that in yourself, or it's useful to, because otherwise you underestimate.
Is this positive psych?
No, it's maps of meaning. Positive psych. It's definitely not that. Why might you be villainous? Well, first of all, because you can be. That's a big deal. You can be. It's actually an offshoot of empathy. This is something that took me decades to figure out. I figured it out when I was studying the book of Genesis, because in the book of Genesis people become self-conscious and they immediately have the knowledge of good and evil. And I just couldn't figure that out. It's like, what the hell's the relationship between that? And then really, I tell you, I thought about that like for 30 years, trying to puzzle that out, and then I realized what it was. if you're self-conscious, you can conceptualize yourself as a being. You know that you are, and you know what you're like, and you know what hurts you and what doesn't. And as soon as you know what hurts you, you know what hurts her. And so that's the knowledge of good and evil that comes along with being self-conscious. This is something that distinguishes human beings from every other animal. You know, a lion will eat you, but it doesn't really want to tear you apart slowly just for the fun of it. Well, it eats you, it just wants to eat you. And you know, you could call that evil. It sucks, that's for sure. But animals are beyond good and evil in that sense. But human beings, man, we can aim our malevolence, and we're really good at it, because we can imagine, God, this would hurt, and if it hurts me, man, it's really going to hurt you. So, and you need to know that you're like that, because you are like that. And if you don't know you're like that, or if you don't think you're like that, you're even more like that than you think. Because the people who are most like that are people who don't think they're like that at all. And you have to contend with that. And that's why in many systems of thinking, the world is conceptualized as a battle between good and evil. And it's an appropriate conceptualization. It's a meta-conceptualization. And the culture is the wise king and the tyrant, and that's always the case. And you're always stuck with that, because as an individual, with your negative side and your positive side, your negative side is the resentful side that is irritated at the limited conditions of being and the suffering that entails, and its arbitrary and unfair nature. And no wonder, like, that side has a case to make. It's not trivial. In the Brothers Karamazov, that argument is laid out beautifully. There's a character, Alyosha, who's a monastery novitiate, and not really a sparkling intellect, but a very good person. And he has a brother, Ivan, and Ivan's a vicious genius. And Ivan just takes Alyosha apart, and partly he does that by telling a story about, that Dostoevsky took this from a news story. The news story was that this mother and father had taken their young daughter and locked her in the outhouse overnight when it was like 30 below, and you know, she stayed out there crying and screaming and froze to death. And Ivan basically said to Alyosha, you know, a world in which that could happen should not be. It's a good argument. You know, and you can multiply that by millions of examples. So the part of us that is opposed to being and resentful, it's got a point, man. The problem, as far as I can tell, is that if you act that out, then it makes what you're objecting to worse. Now, you might be happy about that, and you might think, well, people couldn't be consciously pursuing that, but yes, they can. I would recommend a book called Panzram if you're interested in that sort of thing. It's a book written by a man who raped 1,200 men and killed dozens and burned things down to the ground every chance he got, and tried to start a war between England and the US, and who was aimed at nothing but mayhem. And he wrote an autobiography at the request of a doctor who had befriended him, and he tells you exactly what he did and why. The story. Hero and adversary, order and tyranny, destruction and creation. That's the basic landscape, and outside of that, chaos. And so let's take a break. Here's another way of looking at this idea. The individual is the person who pays attention and explores and masters, or who looks away. And the person inhabits an explored territory, and this is unexplored territory. And so wherever you go, there's you and the two halves of you that you have to contend with, and wherever you are with people, there's the society with its tyrannical and beneficial nature, and the society in some sense is that match between what you're doing and what's happening. It's really important to get that right. And then unexplored territory, that's wherever and whenever